Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we are going to continue to make a wide body fender. Now, this video is actually a video I was not planning on making. After the last video, I mentioned that I would probably do some refinements to the fender and then provide a data set, and I actually did that, but I did get some feedback, some comments, people that were just asking for me to continue on with the entire process. Now, at this point in time, the series is not very popular. I mean, the last video had 700 views or something like that. So the fact that people do want to see the entire thing and it's not, an extremely popular video series at the moment anyways, I don't mind continuing on showing all of the process. If this is the first video that you've come across, and each video I do provide the data set, so you can go to the description and download the data set that you see as a starting point. But the entire series started with Shining 3D sending me a scanner to play with for a few months. And I went through the videos of actually scanning the car, preparing the mesh, and bringing it into Fusion. And the past, 7 or 8 videos, we've been designing the fender flare. This process is not quick and easy. And this is one of the reasons why when people comment or email me and ask me to design them a body kit, first off, Fusion is not the perfect tool for that. You can do it, but there are other tools that are really meant for this type of work. Autodesk has Alias. There's a Alias Concept and Alias Surface. They've changed names over the years. But when you're talking about at a hobby level, you don't really want to spend $4,000 to $10,000 a year on a piece of software just because it's the best tool for the job. If you're just doing this for fun, you have a hobby version of Fusion, you have all the same tools that you see here on the screen as the commercial version, which is still only a couple $100 a year. So keeping that in mind, it's important to note that this process takes a while. There are hurdles that we run into in Fusion that you don't run into with other pieces of software. If you're used to modeling in something like Blender, then it's just it's a similar approach to how you model things, but it's a very different end goal or end result, because what we're looking for here is we're looking for surfaces and solids, not a mesh body. Now, in my case, I'm actually going to be 3D printing this, so I could work in Blender just fine and just print from there. But I do think it's important that we understand the scan data that we're working with, attaching to it using the tools that we have at our disposal in Fusion. With all that out of the way, if you're still following along, I do suggest that you get some of the foundation in using forms. I have plenty of videos on that. There's a nearly 50-part series that's still evolving on mastering forms. Lots of other videos on modeling cars with it. So this series, I'm talking about some of the nuances and things that we run into when we're doing this type of work, but we're not going through all of the basics. So keep that in mind. If there's something that's missing, I've likely covered it somewhere else. And the earlier videos in this series, I did start a bit slower talking about the basic tools. So if you're still with me, you want to follow along, download the description or go to the description, download the data set. What we're going to be doing this time is we're going to be getting rid of some of this extra stuff that we don't need anymore. So the way that we approached this process originally, just as sort of a recap, is we went in and we built out sort of the stock fender shape without any of the wheel opening geometry. So we did this for a couple of reasons. We wanted to have a form body that had the basic shape of the stock fender, so we knew where things like the style lines were going to be, and that helped us downstream when we create things like a smooth fender. We understand where it needs to attach and what the geometry is. And we actually ended up using copies of these faces to build what we're working on now. It's important when you start this process that you have a rough idea of what you want your design to look like, but if you're happy with just playing around with it in 3D, then by all means, just explore. We can copy and paste form bodies and we can make variations. And it's very easy for us to repurpose that. And actually the video 2 or 3 times ago was talking about concept generation and reuse of our data. So now at this point, I'm happy with everything that we've done. So I'm going to start deleting some of these other form bodies just by selecting them and hitting delete on the keyboard. Remember that forms are destructive, meaning that we're not capturing any of that in the timeline. You can go back and you can reopen an older version So for example, I could go back to version 2, I could open that and I can save it as the most current version, and all of those other form bodies would be in there. So while it is destructive, we do have ways that we can get that data back. Now that we're at this point where we've just got one form body we're working on, we can copy it if we need to, but now is the point where we want to talk about final refinements of the shape. Now, overall, the shape is what it's going to be, but there are areas that we need to work on and continue to tweak. Now, there was an update to Fusion this morning when I opened Fusion 360 that could potentially have some effect on the form body. I will mention that as we go along if that does happen. But there are just a couple of areas that are going to be general problems that are not sort of introduced by updates to the software that we want to talk about. Now, these are going to be areas of concern for any design and things that we need to deal with. So one of those is going to be NGons. Now, NGons are going to be faces on our form body that have more than 4 sides. We can have a triangle face, which is going to be flat and something we generally avoid whenever possible. And we can have a 4-sided face, which is our ideal geometry. And then we can have these NGons, which is 5 or more. Now, these NGons appear in car modeling because we're changing the direction of the curvature with the wheel arch. So you'll notice that the faces down here, when they come into the fender, they're still all 4-sided. From here, these are 4-sided, but this sort of in-between area creates a star point and an NGon. Now, the NGon is something that we're likely going to have somewhere in our design, and the star point is something we're going to have somewhere in our design, but we do have the ability to control where those are by moving the geometry around. Now, there are a couple of other areas that I do want to highlight and fix. So in one of the previous videos, I mentioned that I didn't care what happened up here in the geometry. And that the intent of that statement was to say that we're going to be cutting everything away from essentially from here up to here, because that's where the OEM marker light is, and that's where this over fender is going to attach to the car. But my statement of saying I didn't care what happened up here in the front is not really what I meant. So what I think we should understand is that the geometry is always going to be important. We want to make sure that it's smooth and clean whenever possible. However, if there's an area that is going to get cut away or deleted, if you're overbuilding your forms, then you don't need to spend a bunch of time to say, make sure that your creases or edges carry through them perfectly. So what I want to do now is I'm just going to make some minor adjustments. I noticed here that there is a potential problem. I didn't carry that edge forward properly, or maybe I accidentally moved it. This tends to happen when you begin manipulating things in smooth display as opposed to working in box display, because in smooth display, that edge is much bigger. So you feel like you've got more room to begin moving things around and maybe making adjustments. But when you go back to box display, that is a very small edge. And that means that you could very easily cause a surface to overlap itself. And that's not something that we want to do. So making some of those minor adjustments, it's good for us to do at this stage and make sure that we're happy with the overall shape and layout of everything. I'm just going to make some minor tweaks and make sure that I'm happy with the direction that everything is going. Now, here, I'm going to go ahead and grab this entire edge and pull it down. And what I'm looking for is just a visual straight line. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just visually, I want that to be straight. And then over here, where our T-point is, this is likely going to cause some problems in that surface. Again, I'm not super concerned with what's happening up there. As long as the surface is going to not cause problems for me downstream, I'm happy with having T-points up against these edges. However, this one here, you can see that it's causing this surface to sort of roll back on itself, and that's never a good thing. So I'm going to select it, and I'm just going to delete it. I'm going to get off of edit form, and that will allow this edge to sort of repopulate or patch itself, and then we can just double check the geometry. So it creates sort of this weird bulge in this area. So what I want to do is I'm going to come back with insert point and just put it back in there now that this edge is straight, and that'll help sort of fix that bulge in the area. It carries and then fades away that line into the front. And again, that's all getting cut away up to this line and down to here. So I'm not really concerned with making sure I match the curvature of the car. As you rotate things around, every once in a while, you'll see graphic glitches like this. Now, those are not necessarily a problem that we need to worry about. If you're ever worried about it, you can always finish the form and double check the surface body to make sure that it's not there on the surface body. A lot of times you'll see those glitches happen in the form body itself, but when you convert it to a surface, it's not there. So these are all things that we want to just watch out for. A couple of other things that we want to do, I'm going to hide that and go back into the form. We want to control these edges a bit better. Some of these edges look pretty good, like these two edges look like they're parallel, but you can see up here where we get into this fender, things start to get a little bit out of shape. So we need to address that. We need to address these NGons because they are likely pulling on geometry if we rotate this around. It almost looks like this is somewhat of a flat spot, and that's right where that star point is. So this is something that we need to just be mindful of. So let's go ahead and let's work our way around. Let's fix a few things and let's talk about the process as we go. So when I look for areas of a design that need attention or that need to be fixed, at this stage, we're talking about very minor, fine adjustments. We're not talking about major changes to the overall shape. We're talking about refining the position of vertices or edges. And the reason that we're doing that is because we have potential geometry that's been created that is not going to be in line with our design intent. So for example, if we're trying to make, it's a good way to say this, make geometry that is essentially a straight line, at this point, I don't really want to go back and use my scale options to make it an actual straight line. I'm looking visually at what things are going to appear to be. Sometimes there's going to be a difference between appearing to be straight and actually straight, especially when we go between our box and smooth display. So what I'm really focusing on is, does that line look like it's straight and following the curvature of the car? And if so, then I'm happy with that result. Now, if I want to tighten up any of these lines, I can always add more edges to it. And because this NGon is here, I actually want to take this edge and flip it over to the other side. I want to add another edge on the other side. And I'm going to do that by double clicking on this edge. Actually, you know what? Let's go ahead and let's select it. Control double click here. We're going to go to Insert Edge, and we're going to stick it relatively close. And what this does, again, it's going to put something in that's perfectly straight, something that we likely need to adjust. But adding an extra edge in there will give this more of a crisp feel. And because we're now driving it with 3 edges, what ends up happening is we are making it essentially a straighter line. So we're able to drive that straightness by adding additional edges. You'll see it still goes kind of crazy at this NGon here and up here where it kind of rolls around the corner. Those are areas that we will have to fix and address, but it does sort of fix that visual straightness in the corner. So now we're probably going to do that in multiple places, but let's go ahead and let's focus our attention on this corner here. So as I mentioned before, anytime we have a car fender where we've got the shape of the fender going into the wheel arch, those are areas where you're always going to see star points and you're most likely going to see NGons. Now, a couple ways that we can quickly fix NGons would be for us to just simply divide this up so it's 4-sided. Now, I can come up to that edge right there. Remember, we can have T-points, but remember some of the rules. The T-points should end at a straight edge. Now, if we don't end them at a straight edge, it causes other problems for us with curvature. So up here, I likely want to take this and carry it over and just end it right there. And the reason I want to do that is because now I can make some additional adjustments. And actually, while I'm looking at it, I want to carry it up to here. That edge is going to stay, but these edges here are going to move because, again, I don't want just a straight line between any of my edges because that is not going to help us drive the curvature. It's going to cause an inversion or an inflection point. So we want to make sure that we're always either slightly decreasing or increasing the angle between all of these edges. That's going to help us maintain good curvature control. Because if we go to Alt and 2, this is going to show us the box display cage over top of the smooth fender. And this is going to be kind of tricky to see, but if we take a look at some of these corners, we can see that the box is on top of the surface underneath. Now, what this is doing is this edge right here is dictating the direction the surface is traveling into and out of that edge. Because the ones on the other side are relatively flat, the curve ends up happening underneath this edge. And this is important because that's how these forms work. So anytime we get to a position where the edge to edge is completely flat, that means the surface coming into it needs to dip down and back up. Now, sometimes you can get away with this and it's fine, but other times it'll be exaggerated and it will cause you problems downstream. So I try to avoid star points when possible. I try to avoid T-points when possible, but sometimes they're a necessary evil. And we always try to avoid a completely flat transition from one edge to the other. Now, once again, these rules are sometimes meant to be broken. Sometimes we can get away with things and it's okay. Other times it's going to bite us. So this also presents an interesting problem because now we've got this point that's ending, essentially it's ending at a T point, but really we would want that to be somewhere back here. So a couple of ways to fix this. Because we added extra edges here to control this, we can theoretically get rid of this edge and we can use weld vertices to bring this point down. Now, if you're new to this channel and new to these videos, I do want to just make sure that I reiterate in almost all of my videos, we're going through the process together. I didn't pre-model what I'm doing here on the screen and come up with the perfect way to go through it. We're sort of running into these challenges as we go. Now, because of that, there is a lot of exploratory nature of how the software works, playing around with it, and so on. So just keep that in mind. All right, so that looks pretty good. It does sort of taper away. It's not as crisp as it gets close to the fender, but the geometry on the fender actually looks pretty good. There is a little bit of like a dip in here. We can maybe tighten up those lines if needed, but overall, I'm happy with that result without doing too much work. We did introduce some additional T-points, but again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's something that we have to do from time to time. We can try to bring this T-point back and just add it to this top edge. In some cases, it might work. Let's go ahead and take a look. Control and 4. In some cases, that might work okay. You can see it sort of tightened it up. It still blends into that curve. It didn't affect this at all. That still looks nice and round. It's not flat like it used to be. I do want to tighten the transition up in here, but overall I'm pretty happy with the way that worked out. So same thing down here. To tighten up this transition, I'm going to add additional edges and I'm going to bring them all the way to here. So Control and double click and we'll go to Insert Edge. Now remember, Insert Edge with the simple insertion mode, and I say this every time and you're probably tired of hearing it, but with the simple insertion mode, it's going to put an edge in perfectly flat. Now what that means is it's dividing the face up and it's sort of making that flat transition. This is something that we want to adjust. You can see there's sort of like this dimple in and out. It's causing a crease in this fender right here where we have that T-point. You can kind of see a shadow of triangles here, which means that this face is under all kinds of stress. That's not what we want. So what I'm going to do is I am going to take these edges here. I'm going to move them out slightly. And maybe move these ones in slightly. And potentially carry that T-point down a bit further. Let's see what this looks like in smooth display. Control and 4 to hide my edges. It looks pretty good, but we can kind of see from the lighting, the way that the light is bent this direction. Essentially, if you think of taking a piece of paper and grabbing it at the corners and pulling the corners away, opposite corners away, you're getting sort of this folded geometry. It's got a lot of tension right in the middle. So something that we do is we carry that T-point on down the geometry a bit further. Now, I'm actually going to take it down further because I'm going to add an additional edge to crease that one a bit more as well. And let's just take a look. Make sure that we didn't do anything drastically different. And now you can see the light is still bending toward the front, but where we added that edge, it's following the crease a bit more before it sort of fades up. And the reason it fades up is because it's flaring out. That's kind of what we want. So that looks pretty good. Control 6 to bring the edges back. Alt and 1 to go back into box display. And I am going to take it up to here. Once again, insert edge. Bring this one down. And in most cases, when we do an insert edge, I try to make sure that I move everything accordingly. In this case, I'm actually leaving them because what I want to do, because the curvature is entering this sort of section, what I want to do is I want to drive the shape a bit more. Again, we need to think about the original car, where things are flaring out. So you can see we're kind of matching the curvature here and then flaring it out. When we bring the rest of this back, you can see it's kind of going forward a bit. Once again, we're not really concerned with what's happening up here because it's going to get deleted. It's going to get removed. So as long as the curvature back here is okay, that's the main thing that I want to be concerned with. So I want to pull some of this stuff in and just kind of get it out of the way. And this T-point here bulges out. That is not something that we want. I'm going to try to push it back. And if we need to, we will just keep carrying it down the rest of the fender. So you can see it kind of flares out and flares forward. But again, the mesh, we're cutting the surface right here at the bumper all the way up to this hard line and forward. So the fact that it sort of rolls away and flares up here is not a concern to me because it's all going to get trimmed out anyways. I do want to make sure that from this sort of, let's see where it is. Let me bring the edges back. From this point and up, that the geometry is well controlled because that's what we're going to actually use. So if I need to, I can carry some of these edges forward and make sure that we are matching the geometry. But overall, I think I'm pretty happy with the way that that turned out. We were able to clean this up a little bit without having to add too much extra to it. And now we want to go to the back side of this and we want to insert some edges here as well. So we're going to go to insert edge. This gets a little tricky because insert edge, essentially what this is doing is it's averaging the distance between the geometry on the top and the bottom. And because of this NGon here, that is, it's going to be problematic. So let's cancel that. This NGon was not a problem for us, but it should probably be fixed like we did the other one. So I'm going to go to insert point and I'm going to come up to the middle, the red dot, and we'll just carry it up to there and hit enter. Once again, we do want to make sure that we manipulate this a little bit. So from the top view, I want to make sure that we do have a slight change in curvature, which means that I might need to bulge this one out a little bit as well. And maybe even this one. All right, that looks pretty good. All right, let's take a look at it in smooth display. Make sure that we didn't accidentally mess something up here. You kind of see there's like a little shadow there, but it still looks pretty smooth. Visually, I think it would be great if you could toggle on like a render mode similar to going into the render environment, because if we go to render now, it's going to finish the form and convert it to a surface first. It would be kind of nice if we were able to do that without converting it. But now that we've added that extra edge and that star point, now the insert edge is not going to be all twisted. We can go ahead and put it in there. Again, we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to carry that edge. And when we do this and it creates this T-point, as long as we don't change it at this point right here, that T-point is actually going to be decent geometry. If we start changing that T-point, that's when we start to affect change inside of the other surrounding surfaces. And that's something we really don't want to do. So let's take a look at this. Alt-3, Control-4. You can see that we tightened up those lines a little bit. So we're really carrying those factory body lines. There's not a whole lot of the car left here, but visually, this line, it's really hard to see, but there's a line on the car. If I hide the fender, maybe we can see it. There's a line on the car that we're carrying from the front. It gets a little bit wider here. This carries on the door, and then it goes back up and around the window. And that was a really important feature that I wanted to maintain. So when we look at it from the side, visually that's at the same height. So the lines of the car still travel back. Same thing with this and this geometry here. The lines of the car carry onto the door, and those lines on the factory wide body are not there. They're just gone, and it loses that reference. It picks up just before the door and it disappears on the rear quarter. So those are really important elements that I wanted to keep in this design. So I wanted to maintain those as part of the unique feature of the car. It really made the 80s styling to have these hard lines. The AE86 Corolla was very similar in the fact that it had this sort of style line that went into these rounded fenders. And I like to keep that and preserve that and just make sure that we get it a little bit wider. Now from the top, of course, this is quite a bit wider than the factory version, and that line you can see from the top is fairly narrow. But on the wider version, what we're essentially doing is we're just bulging it out and leaving it open at the door. So it's going to carry that same line from the side. Visually, it's going to look very much like the factory lines carried on. But from the front, the back, the top, it's just going to be wider. It's going to be sort of bulged out. So with that in mind, the next step for us is to check a couple other areas on the design. We can see now in smooth display that we are below the mesh in the back. And if we rotate this around, it's going to be kind of hard to see, so bear with me for a second. We can see that we're quite a bit above the mesh in the front. Now that's obviously problematic unless you were trying to redo this design. So for example, if you wanted to carry the fender line all the way out to the bumper and you were going to be remaking the header panel or whatever the case is, that is obviously a design decision, and you could carry those out. For me, this is an over fender and I want it to sit right on top of the factory fender. So I need to do some work to get that down. And unfortunately, there is a little bit of mesh missing in this corner, which does not help us at all. So we're going to explore using some of the mesh tools or some of the form tools to pull to the mesh. But ultimately, what's going to end up happening, if we take a look at this in box display, we need to be extremely careful because the edges that we added here that are controlling the lines of the car, it's going to pull those down to the closest reference point. And what that means is that these are going to start to get a bit wider. And I'll show you an example here. I'm just going to select a couple vertices. Let's just go ahead and do some in the middle. I'm going to bring the mesh back and I'm going to do pull. And what this is going to do is it's going to auto project it to the selected target. And you can see what happens here. It instantly goes kind of crazy. Now that is the auto projection. We could do selected targets, but when we do selected targets, what it's actually looking for is that mesh reference. So auto projection sometimes works okay, sometimes it doesn't. It is, it's affecting where these lines are, and it's going to affect the width of some of those edges. So because of that, I am actually not going to be using the pull tool for this example. Now, for cases where you're maybe making a spoiler, or if you're making a canard to go onto the bumper, or if you're making, let's say, something for the hood, that's a different case where you can take the vertices on your form and pull them down. Because this form has so many different edges that are being controlled, it becomes almost impossible for us to do that. So we need to do it manually, unfortunately, but it's not that big of a process because we can box select some of our geometry here. So we've got to make sure that things like these T-points are going. We can move entire faces if we want to. Let's go ahead and hide the mesh for a second. So we want to make sure that, for example, we bring all of these elements up. So here we've got the vertices on either end of this line, so the whole line will go up. But I'm going to go to a right side view, and I'm just going to pull this up a little bit. And as I do this, I'm going to toggle back and forth between smooth and box display. And we can see that it's pulling it up, and it looks like it's matching pretty good on the back. Now it's going to have to start to come down. And I'm going to do this one section at a time. And I might have to go back and make some corrections to the box display. That's okay. So we're going to just do this a little bit at a time. And what I'm looking for is to just barely see the mesh underneath it. And at this stage, it's not going to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be perfect. But we just want to just barely see that mesh poking through. Because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking this form and we're going to thicken it away from what we have now. So this is essentially the inside of our fender flare. And we're going to do the same thing up front. It's going to be different up front. We're going to end up needing some more edges to control the shape, I think. Let's go to Alt and 1 and see where that is in box display. Yeah, so I think let's go ahead and hide the mesh. This is going to start to be problematic. So I am going to carry this over, and I'm going to make an attempt to fix that width there. Remember, we want to keep the widths consistent, and that's from the top, from the side, from the front, all these different areas. So I'm going to pull this forward, and visually I want it to be about as wide. Now after the fact, I might go back and even add a bit more, add another edge here to control it a bit better. But for right now, I just want to get it to look the same as all the rest. And we can make some fine tweaks later. But you might find that you might have to add additional edges to make this work. So Alt and 3. You can see that things look fairly consistent here. It's below, which is okay. But again, we're just kind of barely seeing that mesh poking through. You will have to note as you zoom in and out, it will change as well. But you can rotate around. And up front, we're going to have to do a little bit of extra work to get this to work out. So let's go ahead and go to box display. And I think what I want to do is I'm going to take this edge. And this might ruin some curvature, but I want to use bevel. I'm just going to allow it to do 1 at 50%. And then I'm going to take this one and slide it. Let's go ahead and slide it this way. And let's take a look what that looks like. So it's obviously dipping down a bit here, but we know that this section here has to move. So again, being very careful with it, I am going to see, you can see here I already missed some of those selections. It's missing those edges. Need to make sure that we have that. Double check your smooth display. This is a problem, but we'll fix that after we get the outside shape kind of lined up. And let's see. So it's still got a bit of a gap there, which means that this needs to come down. Now, if you notice this, again, when you go back and forth between box display and smooth display, you might find that where that edge is not quite where you expect it to be. So you probably will end up making adjustments by moving some of these edges around in order to make things fit. So double click there and take a look at it in smooth display. So again, just moving things around a little bit. We're going to get as close as we can, and then we're going to use box display to fix any problems that we created for ourselves. There is probably no way to do this without creating problems for yourself. So just keep that in mind, that it's probably going to be something that you need to fix. For this one, I am going to pull this in. And I know another sort of tip that I said is never to really work in smooth display. Unfortunately, here I kind of have to, just simply based on the fact that that's the only way we're going to see what the final looks like. You can see we made a mistake, or I did, here in this area. So I'm going to move these points back up. Again, this is all getting cut away up front, so it's not a huge concern to me, because I'm not going to thicken it until after I cut this away. But I still want to just make sure that I'm not doing anything that's drastically going to affect the surface. All right. So looking okay, I think it's fairly close. This section here could come back a little bit more. Let's go ahead and do that. And then let's take a look at this in box display. So in box display, if you find that maybe you want this edge to be in a different place, we can use slide edge, which will help us control where that is. So just double click on it. We'll use slide edge and we'll slide it this way a little bit. And then double check the smooth display. Again, these edges tend to move around quite a bit. I'm going to use edit form. Just get it close. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect either. We are talking about a fairly large 3D print, and that in itself is going to cause problems. If you do find that some of these edges, like this one here, ends up creeping its way up, one way that we can help that out is by carrying one of these other edges forward. Even if we just create a T-point here, by carrying another edge forward, we should be able to help preserve the location of that edge. I'll just carry it to here. And if we take a look in smooth display, it'll pull that down just a little bit more because it's driving the shape. All right, overall that looks okay. Probably not perfect, but again, as I've mentioned in a lot of these videos, I could spend hours and hours just manually adjusting things and tweaking things. This edge here definitely needs to come down. So at this point, I've been really working on multiple edges. Now I'm just going to focus my attention on this inside edge. And what we're going to do is from the side, you'll notice that, for example, right here, if we use edit form, the distance or the width of this face is fairly consistent everywhere, but I think that it needs to be less than it is. So I need to start sort of narrowing that down. And the same thing goes over here. So just select that vertex, sort of pull this down, and one by one. So once again, I've mentioned this many, many times, and I will keep mentioning it. This tool, Forms in Fusion, it's not really intended for automotive modeling, Class A surfacing. It's never what the tool was intended for. It's definitely a nice way for us to get complex organic shapes and surfaces without having to do a ton of sketching and surfacing. But it's just we're pushing the tool past really what it was designed to do. So now we can see that we've got kind of this marbling effect. We can see the mesh underneath it, and I think that looks pretty good. Again, we're talking about a fairly large 3D print. It's going to get cut away right here, so we need to make sure that where it's hitting the body here is okay. We are going to do a little bit of surfacing work to blend the width of the fender to the marker light on the side, because that's just not going to, it's not going to hit in the right spot. And we will need to add another edge to get it close to the fender, the original fender here. I'm going to say okay for now. And I think let's see. Let's go ahead and take a look at in-box display. I think so far everything looks pretty good. We won't really have a good idea where this needs to be until we do a bit more work, but some other things to consider or think about are going to be the shape of the flare. So for example, this is the factory air dam, and I'm considering leaving it factory at the front, but making some additional pieces to stick onto it here to sort of fill in some of the space. So you need to think about the way in which the bottom transitions as it rolls under, and the way that that geometry is ultimately going to work on the car. But for right now, I'm going to leave that as is. In the next video, we'll maybe add some extra edges in here, and we'll talk about the surfacing tools that we need to finish this off. Another thing that we should consider, again, is potentially adding additional edges if we want the curvature to be a bit tighter. Right now, I don't really know, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate over to render and just take a look at this in render. So this gives us a little bit different lighting, and what we're looking to see, again, we want those body lines. We want to see those body lines pretty good in the shadows. We're going to see them on the back. It looks like there might be a potential issue there that I want to fix. And you can kind of see from the back, it might be hard to see on the computer. There's like a wrinkle, or like a dimple there. So that needs to be fixed for sure, unless we're cutting that away for something. And from the top, you can kind of see again that marbling going through the fender. We could do a little bit more work to get it closer or better. This is a stick-on over fender. There is going to be some tolerance and some discrepancy between printing all these different pieces and putting them together. But overall, it maintains the factory sort of shape and design intent. It carries it wider, quite a bit wider. It does match the body lines, and there's still more work to be done, of course. We need to figure out how it's going to attach to the back of the car and how it's going to actually attach to the OE fender. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the shape. I want to do some more final adjustments. And again, it's just a process that takes time. Those final adjustments can really just add hours and hours to the process. But if you are doing this for yourself, then it's certainly worth the effort. If you are trying to design body kits for production, then this is not the tool that I would use. Not to say that you can't do it, but you're just going to be fighting a battle because you just don't have the control over the form that you are really looking for at that level. We have to do a lot of things, like we don't have edge weighting, so we end up having to add a bunch of edges in areas where we want to control that. And that causes problems like we saw in this area with the star points and transitions between the wheel arch and the fender. And those are things that software packages that are made for this type of work, those are things that they don't have to worry about, because they're ultimately made to handle those kinds of problems. So at this point, we're getting closer. I don't know how many videos this is going to take to do. It's just, again, it's a long process, and there's a lot of back and forth that happens and time that it takes. But if you have any questions up to this point, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.